The sun sank low behind the rugged hills, casting long shadows over the ranch. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from last night's fire. Inside the small cabin, the rancher's wife moved quietly, careful not to wake her husband. The house was empty most of the day, the man always busy with cattle and the never-ending chores of the land. She had long grown used to the solitude, the routine, the constant rhythm of survival that came with living on the frontier. But today, there was something different in the air. Something that made her hands tremble slightly as she carried a small bundle of food toward the edge of the barn. Hidden in the shadows, just beyond the fence, was a prisoner, a young Apache warrior. He had been captured a few days ago during a raid, and the rancher had chained him to a post near the stable. He was strong, silent, and wary of every movement around him. His eyes held the weight of loss and the fire of pride, and she could not help but feel drawn to the quiet strength behind his stare. She had seen him struggle to eat, stubborn and proud, refusing the rations her husband left for him. Something about his silence stirred her, a strange pull she could not name. She had decided to feed him secretly, slipping scraps through the fence when no one was looking, hiding behind the tall stacks of hay so no one would catch her. The first time she approached him, her heart pounded so hard she feared he would hear it. The wind shifted and carried the sound of her skirt brushing against the wooden beams of the barn. The Apache shifted his head slowly, eyes narrowing, unsure whether to trust her or strike at the intruder who dared enter his world. She froze, afraid that her presence would spark violence, that this act of compassion would cost her everything. But she held the food out, her hands trembling, and in that instant something unspoken passed between them. He did not take it immediately, only watched, a storm of suspicion and hunger in his gaze. And yet, when he finally stepped forward, he took the offering with a gentleness that surprised her. Days passed in the same quiet rhythm. She would slip away from her chores, steal moments behind the barn, and feed him. At first, it was just scraps of bread and bits of meat. She whispered small words in the air, words he could not understand, but the sound of her voice seemed to calm him, steady the tension that had built in his muscles from days of captivity. Slowly, he began to respond in ways that were small but meaningful, a nod, a soft grunt of acknowledgement, a watchful glance that followed her movements. The walls between them were fragile but growing thinner, a silent understanding forming in the space where fear and survival once ruled. Her heart carried a secret that weighed heavier with each passing day. She could not tell her husband what she was doing, could not risk the ranch, her family, or her own safety. And yet, every time she saw the Apache, every time she held out her hand with a small piece of bread, she felt something that she had never felt before. A spark, a quiet longing, a sense that her life was no longer entirely her own. She was drawn to him in a way that frightened her, that made her question everything she had believed about loyalty, love, and destiny. He was not just a prisoner to her. He was a living story, a world she could not reach but wanted to touch. She learned to watch him carefully, noticing the smallest details, the way his eyes lingered on the horizon, the way he moved with purpose even when chained, the way he seemed to measure the space around him as if calculating an escape. There was strength in him, undeniable strength, and something deeper, something that seemed almost like honor or pride. She began to imagine what life had been like for him before he was captured, what his family might be thinking, and whether they even survived. The thought haunted her, but it also drew her closer to him. One evening, the wind carried a sharp warning. A patrol of men approached the ranch, searching for the missing prisoner who had slipped through their hands once before. Her heart raced as she ran to the barn, fearing discovery. The Apache watched her from his chains, eyes wide and alert, muscles tense. She shoved the food toward him and whispered, her voice barely audible, that he had to be ready, that tonight could change everything. His hands flexed against the chain, the raw power in his grip reminding her of how fragile her life could become if she were caught. But in that moment, She realized that it was no longer fear that guided her, it was choice. She had chosen him in a way that her heart understood, but her mind could barely accept. As night fell, the sky dark and full of stars, the Apache shifted, looking toward the hills. His jaw tightened, and for the first time he spoke a word she could not understand. Yet the sound carried a promise, a warning, and something else, hope. She knew he was planning something, plotting his next move, and she had no way of stopping him even if she wanted to. Her chest tightened with anticipation and dread. The quiet farm, the simple life she had known, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Her husband returned from the cattle early the next morning, humming a tune as he entered the cabin. She moved quickly, hiding the last scraps of food under her apron, forcing her expression to remain calm and ordinary. But inside, she trembled. She knew the Apache was watching, waiting for the right moment, and she also knew that her life was changing in ways she could not yet understand. He was more than a prisoner now. He was a force, a presence that had begun to reshape her world, a figure who would become impossible to ignore. The days became a careful dance. She continued her secret visits, slipping closer to the chain without being seen. The Apache watched her in silence, his presence commanding and quiet, a tension that made her heart beat faster than she cared to admit. He began to rely on her for small things, the food, the warmth of human presence in a cold, lonely world. And she began to rely on him, on the strange comfort he brought, the pull of something she could not yet name but felt deep in her soul. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across the hills. Rain pelted the roof and wind howled through the trees. She ran to the barn to deliver the meager rations she had hidden. The Apache moved swiftly, eyes gleaming with something she could not decipher. She held out the food, soaked through, trembling from both cold and fear, and he took it with a look that seemed almost like gratitude. She realized then that he was no longer merely surviving. He was aware of her, aware of the bond forming between them, aware of something that could not be broken by chains or fear. That night, she sat by the cabin window, listening to the rain and thinking about the path her life had taken. She had been a quiet, obedient wife, living the predictable life of the ranch, but the Apache had shifted everything. He had awakened something within her, something that had lain dormant, waiting for the spark that only he could provide. And as she watched the rain, her mind raced with possibilities, with danger, with desire. She knew that her choices would have consequences, but she also knew that she could not turn back. Suddenly, she heard a sound from outside, the soft, careful movement of someone approaching the cabin. Her heart leaped into her throat. The Apache was near, no chains to hold him this time, his shadow blending with the darkness of the night. She stood frozen, every sense alert, knowing that the moment had come. The quiet life she had known, the simple days of chores and routine, were over. The future stretched before her like the untamed prairie wild, unpredictable, and entirely hers to face. And then, just as her hand reached for the door, a sharp crack echoed from the hills, followed by distant voices. Her heart sank as she realized that danger was closing in from every side. The Apache looked at her, eyes filled with the same determination she felt in her own chest. In that instant, she understood that their fates were bound together, that nothing would ever separate them again. Whatever came next, whatever storms they would face, would be shared. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was her destiny, the one who would shape every day of her life from this moment forward. But the storm outside was relentless, and the distant voices grew closer. She could feel the tension in the air, the uncertain edge of what was about to unfold. The Apache tensed, ready to move, and she knew that the next choices would define everything: freedom, danger, and the life she had yet to live. Her hand hovered over the door, heart pounding, and for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of fate pressing down on her. The night had begun, the wind howled, and somewhere out there, destiny waited to claim them both. The rancher's wife took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that there was no turning back. She did not yet know how the night would end, or what sacrifices would come, or how the bond with the Apache would transform her life forever. But in that moment, she understood something with absolute clarity. He was no longer a stranger, no longer a prisoner. He was her future, her danger, and her hope, all rolled into one. And as the door creaked open, the storm at her back, the unknown ahead, she felt the first true pulse of a life she had never imagined possible. The rain lashed against the cabin, the night held its breath, and the shadowed figure of the Apache waited just beyond the door, ready to step into a life that neither of them could yet fully understand. The wind carried the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the hills, the first sign that the world beyond the ranch had not forgotten him, and that the path they were about to take would be anything but easy. In the quiet, tense moments before the storm and before destiny claimed them, the rancher's wife and the Apache shared one final, fleeting look, an unspoken promise that their lives were now entwined, and that whatever came next, they would face it together. The night waited, holding its secrets, as the first move in a new life began. The doors swung open slowly, the wind driving rain across the threshold, and the Apache stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cabin with a quiet intensity. He was soaked from the storm, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his clothes clung to his lean, powerful frame. The rancher's wife held her breath, unsure whether to move closer or step back. He did not speak, only nodded once, a simple acknowledgment that they were now bound together by choice as much as by circumstance. Her heart raced. She knew the storm outside was the least of their worries. The world beyond the ranch was full of men who would not understand, would not forgive, would see him only as danger. And yet, something in his presence felt safe, as if he alone could anchor her in the chaos that was about to unfold. She glanced toward the window, the shadows of the hills dark and jagged beneath the night sky. She had lived here for years, watching the sun rise and fall over the same landscape, feeling the slow, unchanging rhythm of life on the frontier. But tonight, everything had shifted. The Apache brought with him a current of uncertainty, a sense that nothing would ever settle back into the quiet routine she had known. She realized then that her secret had been more than a small act of kindness. It had been a turning point, a spark that lit a fire neither of them could control. And she could feel it now, in the tension in his stance, in the weight of his gaze, in the way the air between them seemed charged with a quiet energy. As the wind rattled the cabin walls, she finally found her voice. "You cannot stay here long," she whispered. Her words trembled, though she tried to hide it. "They will come for you. They will search every hill, every trail." He looked at her, eyes unreadable, and for a moment she felt the full measure of his strength, the silent confidence that had made her heart leap from the first moment she had seen him. He made no reply, only reached out and touched her hand briefly, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than any words could. It was a promise and a warning, a signal that whatever came next, they were tied together, for better or worse. She stepped back, giving him space, and for a few moments they simply watched each other, the storm outside and the cabin around them fading into a blur. Her mind began to drift, to remember how he had arrived here in the first place. The Apache had been captured during a raid, taken against his will, chained and left to wait for judgment at the hands of her husband and his men. She had seen him in those first hours, defiant, proud, refusing to bend even under chains. She had been drawn to him immediately, not just by the quiet strength he radiated, but by the glimpses of a life she could not imagine, a life shaped by survival, by loyalty to a people, and a code she barely understood. Over the days that followed his capture, she had learned more than she expected. She learned to recognize the subtle signals of his body, the way he measured distance, the way he tested the boundaries of the space around him, the way he could move with quiet precision even when confined. She saw intelligence and strategy in every gesture, and she knew that he was far more than a simple prisoner. He carried with him the weight of his people, of stories and experiences that stretched beyond her comprehension. And she realized that in feeding him, in showing him a small measure of trust and care, she was not just helping him survive, she was forming a bond that would shape her own life in ways she could not yet see. Her husband's footsteps echoed in the distance, and she flinched. Every day he seemed more absorbed in the land, in the cattle, in the routine of frontier life. Yet she could never be sure how long it would take before he noticed the subtle changes around the cabin. The Apache had taught her patience, the quiet art of waiting, of reading the world without revealing your thoughts. She had learned to slip through shadows, to carry scraps of food without leaving a trace, and to hold her breath when danger approached. It was a skill she never imagined needing, yet it had become essential to survival, not just his, but hers as well. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, tapping against the wooden roof, and she moved closer to the Apache, her hands instinctively brushing the damp strands of hair from his face. She wanted to know more about him, to understand the life that had brought him here, but she also feared that asking would break the fragile silence they had maintained. Instead, she allowed herself to imagine his past. She pictured the sun rising over the mesas and canyons, the distant cries of horses, the crackling of fires at night, the whispered counsel of warriors in a land she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Each vision drew her closer to him, filled her imagination with colors and sounds she had never known, and made the walls of her simple life seem smaller and smaller. She remembered the first night she had sneaked to him with food, the way he had looked at her, wary, uncertain, and yet not hostile. He had accepted the bread with a deliberate caution, tasting each bite slowly, as if measuring whether trust could exist between them. She remembered the faintest hint of a nod, the first acknowledgement that he understood her gesture. That night, she had felt a shift, a quiet moment that had changed everything. It had been the beginning of a bond that neither chains nor fear could break, the first step toward a connection that would come to define her life in ways she had never imagined. Now, standing together in the cabin, the storm outside a distant roar, she understood the depth of what she had started. He was not just a man in chains. He was a force, a presence that challenged her understanding of the world and herself. She felt the pull of destiny, of a life that had been waiting for him to arrive, and she knew that her future was entwined with his. Every thought she had ever held about safety, about routine, about loyalty, seemed to shift beneath her feet, replaced by something urgent and undeniable. The Apache's eyes, dark and unyielding, scanned the cabin again, landing briefly on the door. He was aware of the danger outside, of the men who would come searching, of the fragile boundaries that separated them from the unknown. Yet there was no hesitation in his stance, no wavering in his gaze. She realized then that his strength was not only in his body or his skill, but in the quiet certainty that he carried within him. He knew what needed to be done, and he would do it with precision, with patience, with the relentless force of someone who had survived far worse than a storm or a small band of pursuers. She stepped closer to him, her hands brushing his arm, and felt a shock of warmth run through her. She had never been close to anyone like this, had never allowed herself to imagine a life outside the bounds of the ranch and the safety of her husband's routines. Yet now she could see a path unfolding before her, dark and uncertain, full of danger and promise, and she felt herself drawn to it. He was a key to a world she had never known, a guide into a life shaped by courage, survival, and the quiet, unbreakable bond of trust. Suddenly, a sound from outside made her flinch, a branch snapping, carried on the wind, close enough that it could have been a man approaching. The Apache moved swiftly, silently, taking position near the door. She followed instinctively, heart hammering in her chest, and realized that she trusted him completely, without question. Every moment they had shared in secret, Every hidden gesture and whispered offering had built a foundation that could not be shaken. And yet, she also knew that danger was closer than ever, that the world outside the cabin would not allow this bond to exist peacefully for long. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and tried to prepare for what might come. The Apache's hand brushed hers briefly, a reminder that they faced whatever lay ahead together. She could feel the tension in the air, the silent knowledge that their lives had changed irrevocably, that every choice from this moment on would carry weight far beyond the walls of the cabin or the limits of the ranch. The rain had eased, the night sky dark and heavy, and somewhere in the hills, unseen forces were moving, drawing closer, testing the boundaries of safety and trust. Her thoughts drifted to the future, to the unknown path that lay ahead. She knew that she could not turn back, that the world she had known, the simple, predictable life of the ranch, was gone forever. The Apache had become more than a prisoner. He had become her guide, her anchor, the force that would shape every day of her life. She did not yet know what trials awaited them, what dangers or sacrifices would come, but she understood that they would face them together. And in that understanding, there was a strange comfort, a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The storm had passed, but the tension remained thick and unyielding. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hills, carried by the wind, and she could feel the pulse of danger close at hand. The Apache's gaze was steady, unwavering, a silent promise that he was ready for whatever came next. She felt the same resolve settle into her own chest, a quiet determination that matched his. Together they would step into the night, into the unknown, into a life that had been waiting for this moment all along. And as she reached for the door, the first hint of dawn breaking over the distant hills, she understood with absolute clarity that her life had changed forever. The Apache was no longer a stranger, no longer a prisoner, no longer a figure from the shadows. He was her destiny, the one who would shape her life completely, the one who would guide her through danger, through uncertainty, through the unknown. The world outside the cabin was vast and unforgiving, and yet, for the first time in her life, she felt ready. The wind carried the sound of movement, distant but growing, and the rancher's wife and the Apache shared a brief, unspoken look, a connection that could not be broken, a bond forged in secrecy, courage, and the quiet strength of survival. The first steps of their journey together were about to begin, and though the night still held its secrets, they knew one thing with certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. The cabin door swung open, the cool air rushing in, and the shadow of the Apache fell across the threshold, waiting for her to step forward, ready to face the world outside. The sound of approaching footsteps carried across the hills, the first sign that their time of hiding was ending, and that the choices they made in the coming hours would define every moment of the life ahead. The rancher's wife hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping into the night, into the unknown, into the life she had longed for without realizing it. The Apache followed, silent and steady, the rain-soaked earth beneath their feet, the storm behind them, and the promise of destiny guiding every step. And in that moment, as dawn painted the horizon in shades of gold and gray, the world held its breath, waiting for the story of a life changed forever to unfold. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the faintest sound of voices from the hills, and the rancher's wife stiffened. She glanced at the Apache, who had paused at the edge of the tree line, eyes narrowing as he listened. His muscles tensed, coiled like a spring, ready to move at the first sign of danger. She felt a cold weight settle in her chest, realizing that the quiet hours of secrecy and small gestures of trust had ended. The world beyond the cabin had begun to encroach, and with it, every choice she had made, the hidden food, the quiet care, the stolen moments, was about to be tested. She followed him silently, careful not to make a sound that would betray their position. The hills stretched before them, rolling and rugged, dotted with scrub and boulders that offered cover but also gave no guarantees. The Apache moved with a precision born of experience, scanning the ground, the trees, the horizon, reading patterns in a landscape she could barely see. She had never felt so aware of the weight of every step, of every sound, of every shadow. Each moment carried the potential for discovery, for confrontation, for violence. The voices grew louder, closer, and she could make out fragments of words, men searching, calling for someone. Her husband was nowhere in sight, and that absence brought a mix of relief and fear. She had always trusted him to protect the ranch, yet she knew that if he came upon them now, he would see only the prisoner and her involvement, and nothing else would matter. The Apache's hand brushed hers briefly, a silent command to stay low, and she obeyed, crouching behind a rock as he peered across the valley. They were not alone. Figures moved in the distance, mounted on horses, their lanterns flickering in the growing light of dawn. She counted at least a dozen, all searching systematically, their horses kicking up mud from the wet ground. It was clear they had tracked him from the capture, that nothing would stop their pursuit. The Apache's jaw tightened, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing options, measuring risks, preparing for confrontation, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. The man who had once seemed almost like a distant force of nature was now the center of her world, the one who would lead them through whatever danger lay ahead. She thought of the ranch, of her life before him, and of the simplicity she had clung to so tightly. Every memory felt distant now, a world she could not return to. She had chosen this path, chosen him, and there was no turning back. Yet even as she followed, even as she trusted, a part of her mind clung to fear. She did not yet understand the depth of the danger, the lengths to which these men would go, or the consequences that could come if they were caught. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow on the hillside, made her pulse race, and she realized that survival depended as much on instinct as on courage. The Apache led them through a narrow ravine where the searchers' voices were slightly muffled by the curve of the hills. He moved silently, carefully placing each foot on stable ground, avoiding dry branches and loose stones that might betray their location. She struggled to keep up, her legs burning with exertion, yet she could not afford to falter. The bond they had built in secrecy now became the thread that held them together in danger. She could sense his tension, the way he scanned, measured, and calculated, and she began to see the logic behind his patience. Survival was not just about speed or strength. It was about perception, about timing, about knowing when to act and when to wait. They paused at the top of a ridge, the searchers below beginning to fan out, their lanterns cutting through the mist. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on them, the first true sense that the frontier was not a safe place, that every choice carried risk, and that the past could not protect them from what was coming. The Apache crouched beside her, pointing silently to a narrow trail that wound through the trees, a path that could give them cover if they moved quickly. She nodded, understanding his unspoken direction, and followed, stepping lightly, keeping her breath slow, keeping her heart steady. As they moved, she thought again of the man she had fed in secret, of the strength and pride that had drawn her to him, of the quiet bond that had grown between them. She realized that the fear she felt was inseparable from hope, that every risk carried the potential for something greater. She could not know what lay ahead, could not predict whether they would survive, could not see whether the path they had chosen would lead to freedom or to ruin. Yet in that uncertainty, she felt alive in a way she never had before, a part of a world larger than the small cabin and the predictable rhythms of ranch life. Below them, the searchers began to shift, sensing movement, voices calling out more urgently. She felt a sudden pressure in the air, the silent warning that they had been spotted, that time was running out. The Apache did not falter. He adjusted his stance, assessing the terrain, measuring distances, considering angles of approach and escape. She realized that she was witnessing more than skill. She was witnessing instinct honed by experience, a mind that could read danger before it struck. And she knew that the lives of both of them depended on his judgment, on his ability to outthink and outmaneuver the men who pursued him. The trail led them through a dense thicket, the branches scratching at her skin, the mud soaking through her shoes, yet she pressed on, trusting his lead. She could hear the searchers shouting below, frustrated by the sudden loss of their target. She imagined the fury that would spread through them if they realized how close the Apache had come to escaping their grasp, and she felt both fear and admiration. He had survived worse than storms, worse than chains, worse than betrayal, and she understood that his presence was not only a shield but a challenge, forcing her to confront the limits of her own courage. As they climbed higher, the wind whipping rain into their faces, she glimpsed the distant outline of the valley below, the searchers' lanterns like tiny stars scattered across the dark earth. She realized that the world had grown enormous, filled with unseen dangers and forces beyond her understanding. The Apache's presence beside her grounded her, gave her a sense of purpose, of direction, and yet she knew that even his skill could not guarantee safety. Every step carried risk, every moment a potential turning point, and she could feel the tension building, knotting in her stomach like a living thing. They paused again, this time at the edge of a small clearing, the trees forming a natural barrier on three sides, the fourth opening to a slope that could lead them further into the hills. The Apache crouched, scanning the terrain, and she mirrored him, trying to see what he saw, to anticipate danger before it arrived. She realized that the night's journey had changed her in ways she could not yet name, that fear and trust and determination were entwined, and that the simple life she had known was gone. The wind carried a faint sound of movement, a branch snapping somewhere beyond the trees, and she felt the first real stirrings of panic. The Apache's hand pressed gently on her shoulder, a signal to stay calm, and she obeyed, drawing strength from the silent command. She realized then that their journey was more than survival. It was a test of patience, a challenge to their instincts, a dance with danger that required complete trust in one another. And as the sounds of the searchers grew closer, she felt a new awareness settle over her, a recognition that every decision, every gesture, every choice of path could mean life or death, freedom or capture for both of them. Suddenly, a voice broke through the rain, sharp and commanding, echoing across the clearing. The searchers had found the trail again. She froze, and the Apache's eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body coiled like a bowstring. She could see the calculation in his gaze, the quick mental map of escape routes and obstacles forming with every passing second. She felt the pull of panic, but also the pull of determination, the sense that she could not turn back now, that the life she had chosen was irreversibly tied to his. He took a step forward, motioning for her to follow, and together they moved toward the edge of the clearing. Her legs ached, her breath came in ragged bursts, but she pressed on, understanding that hesitation could be fatal. Every sound of pursuit made her heart pound faster, every flash of lantern light a reminder of the danger that pressed behind them. And yet, even as the tension mounted, even as the storm and the searchers closed in, she felt an undeniable thrill, a sense that she was part of something far larger than herself, something that demanded courage and resilience and faith in the man beside her. The slope led them into a narrower trail, winding through dense trees, the underbrush tearing at their clothing, the mud sucking at their boots. She could hear voices close behind, shouts and the sound of horses, and she realized that the chase had become a test, not only of skill and survival, but of wits and instinct. The Apache moved ahead with careful precision, every step deliberate, every motion calculated to minimize noise and maximize advantage. She followed, relying on him completely, her pulse synced to his, her senses sharpened to the point of raw awareness. A sudden flash of movement to the side made her stumble, and the Apache caught her arm, steadying her instantly. Her heart raced, the sound of pursuit deafening in her ears, yet she felt a strange calm in the presence of his steady hands, his unwavering gaze. She understood that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer alone, that the bond forged in secrecy and trust could not be broken, and that the life she had clung to had been replaced by one defined by courage, resilience, and the unpredictable pull of destiny. They paused briefly, hidden behind a thick grove, listening to the searchers approach. The voices called out again, frustration creeping into the tones, and she realized that the danger was immediate, that capture could come at any moment. Yet in that tension, in that heartbeat between pursuit and escape, she felt a strange exhilaration, a knowledge that she had chosen this path, that every risk was hers to take, and that the man beside her, the Apache, was both protector and guide, anchor and challenge, all at once. The trail narrowed further, the trees thickening, and she understood that the path ahead would test them in ways they could not yet predict. Every step was uncertain, every rustle could signal disaster, and yet the bond between them had become the only certainty in a world of shifting shadows. The rain had eased into a light drizzle, the wind still sharp, and she felt the weight of anticipation pressing down, the sense that the next move could change everything. The Apache turned his head, meeting her gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement that whatever lay ahead, they faced it together. She nodded, understanding the unspoken promise, the unbreakable trust, and together they stepped forward, deeper into the forest, toward a destiny that neither of them fully understood, but that would define every day of their lives. The voices of the searchers grew fainter as they pressed into the trees behind, but the tension did not ease. Every moment carried the possibility of discovery, every shadow a potential threat, every choice a turning point. The rancher's wife realized that the frontier had shifted from a place of routine and safety into a landscape of danger and uncertainty, and that the life she had chosen with its risks, its trust, and its unknowns was only beginning. And as they moved further into the unknown, she understood with certainty that nothing would ever be the same, that the Apache was more than a prisoner, more than a guide, more than a presence in her life. He was the force that would shape her days, the companion who would stand beside her in danger, and the center of a world that had suddenly grown vast, unpredictable, and alive with possibilities. The forest thickened around them, the trees growing taller, denser, their trunks like silent sentinels in the misty dawn. Every step forward felt heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of what was coming. The rancher's wife stumbled on a root, her boots slick with mud, and the Apache caught her arm without a word. His touch was firm, grounding her, anchoring her to the present. She realized that every instinct she had developed over the past days, the quiet patience, the careful movements, the awareness of danger, was about to be tested to its limits. The men pursuing them were closer now, their shouts cutting through the forest, echoing off the hills like distant thunder. She could feel the tension in the Apache's muscles, the way his eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, measuring, calculating, anticipating. She had watched him survive storms, hunger, captivity, and yet the urgency in his movements now was unlike anything she had seen before. They were not simply running. They were navigating a gauntlet of threats, invisible and immediate, and every choice could determine life or death. She pressed herself closer to him, feeling the pulse of his energy, the quiet rhythm of his breath, and she understood with a certainty that sent shivers down her spine. Nothing would protect them except their own skill, instinct, and trust in one another. The trail twisted sharply, forcing them down a narrow ravine where the trees formed a near impenetrable wall. The forest floor was slick with mud and fallen leaves, and every branch that scraped against her shoulder made her flinch. She could hear the horses behind them, hooves pounding, the shouts of men growing louder. She realized that the distance they had gained was shrinking fast. The Apache's voice broke the silence, low and commanding, whispering instructions she could barely follow but obeyed instinctively. He moved ahead with deliberate precision, guiding her along the only safe path, while simultaneously watching the forest for any hint of an ambush. A sudden crack from above made her gasp, and she ducked instinctively. A branch had fallen from the weight of the storm, landing mere inches from where they crouched. The Apache's gaze swept the treetops and the underbrush alike, and she saw the silent calculation behind his narrowed eyes. Danger was not only behind them, it could strike from anywhere. The forest itself had become part of the test, each tree and shadow a potential threat, each movement requiring the utmost vigilance. Her heart pounded, every beat echoing the urgency of their flight, and she realized that fear and exhilaration were entwined in a way she had never felt before. They reached a small clearing, the mist curling around the bases of trees like smoke. The Apache crouched behind a fallen log, gesturing for her to stay low. Below, the searchers had gained sight of them, their lanterns flashing intermittently through the thinning fog. She could hear their voices, sharp, commanding, frustrated at the slow progress of tracking the fugitives. Her pulse raced. This was the moment when all the tension of the chase, the secretive feeding, the stolen moments, the careful calculations would collide with reality. She felt the weight of every choice she had made, every small risk she had taken, bearing down on her like a physical force. The Apache whispered again, and she leaned in to hear him. His plan was clear, simple in his mind yet fraught with risk. They would move across the clearing in a single motion, using the shadows of the trees as cover, slipping along a narrow ridge that would eventually lead them to the higher hills. It was dangerous, requiring speed, precision, and absolute silence. One mistake, one misstep, and the men below would see them, and capture or worse would be inevitable. She swallowed hard, forcing her shaking hands to remain steady, and nodded, ready to follow. The first move was the hardest. He dropped to the ground, sliding silently from the cover of the log, and she followed, landing in a crouch that sent mud flying. The sound of her boots hitting the wet leaves seemed deafening in her ears, yet no one below reacted immediately. The Apache gestured for her to move forward, and she obeyed, inch by inch, step by step, her eyes fixed on his form, trusting him utterly. The clearing stretched before them like a gauntlet, open and exposed, yet the line of trees at the far edge promised cover if they could reach it. Every second dragged, every heartbeat counted, and she could feel the forest itself pressing in on them, the mist like a living force testing their resolve. A shout rose from below, sharp and urgent, and the sound of horses quickened. They had been spotted. She froze, panic threatening to rise, but the Apache's hand pressed on her shoulder, steadying her. He whispered a single word, and she followed, darting forward into the shadows, twisting around a tree just as a lantern beam cut through the clearing where they had stood moments ago. She felt the brush of leaves on her arms, the pull of mud on her boots, and the thrill of danger surged through her like electricity. Each step was a calculated risk, each movement a gamble with life and freedom. They reached the ridge, the narrow path cutting through dense undergrowth. Below, the searchers were shouting, pointing, advancing cautiously. She could hear the snap of twigs under the horses' hooves, the sharp commands of men who would not rest until they had captured the fugitive. Her heart raced, and she realized that the chase had become more than a test of survival. It had become a battle of wits, a struggle of timing, skill, and instinct. Every choice they made could tip the balance, and every second carried the potential for disaster. The Apache moved ahead, leading her along the ridge with care, every step deliberate, every glance scanning for danger. She felt the mud sucking at her boots, the wind cutting at her face, the strain of exhaustion weighing down her limbs, yet she pressed on, driven by trust, determination, and the knowledge that turning back was impossible. The forest seemed endless, each bend in the trail hiding both promise and peril, each shadow a potential threat, and she realized that their lives had become entirely entwined with the land, the elements, and the people pursuing them. A sudden crack of a branch behind them froze her in place. She spun just in time to see a figure emerging from the trees, lantern in hand. One of the searchers had broken away from the main group. Her heart leapt into her throat, but the Apache reacted instantly, moving between her and the man with a fluid precision she could barely follow. His hand flashed to the small blade at his belt, a warning that was silent yet unmistakable. The man froze, uncertain, and she felt a thrill of fear and anticipation pulse through her. This was the closest they had come to confrontation, and yet she knew it was only the beginning. The searcher's eyes flicked from the Apache to her, confusion and doubt mixing with the determination in his stance. He shouted a warning to the others below, but the Apache's gaze never wavered, his movements calculated, controlled. The rancher's wife felt her pulse sync with his, every instinct tuned to his actions, every thought focused on survival. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the mist curling like smoke, the tension so thick she could almost touch it. Then another shout came from below, closer now, more urgent. The main group of searchers had realized where they were headed, and the chase was about to reach its peak. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of fear, excitement, and an undeniable sense of destiny. Every choice they had made, every step along the ridge, had led to this moment. And yet, even as the danger pressed in from every side, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She could not turn back, and neither could he. Their lives were intertwined now, bound by trust, courage, and the quiet strength that had grown between them. The Apache signaled for her to move, and she followed, careful not to stumble. The ridge twisted sharply, dropping into a narrow gully that promised temporary cover. She glanced back, the searchers' lanterns like fireflies in the fog, growing closer with every heartbeat. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her muscles screamed, yet she pushed forward, following his lead, trusting his judgment implicitly. Each step was a test, each movement a gamble, and every second stretched into an eternity. They reached the gully, pressing against the side of the ridge, mud and rain soaking through their clothing. The Apache whispered instructions, pointing to a fallen tree that could provide temporary shelter. She crouched behind it, feeling the wind cut through her, the forest alive with sound and movement. The searchers were almost upon them, their voices louder, sharper, more insistent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized how close they had come to capture, how narrow the margin of survival had been. Then, a sudden rustle above caught her attention. A branch shifted, leaves rattling, and she tensed, ready for confrontation. The Apache moved in front of her, body coiled, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. She felt his hand brush hers briefly, a grounding touch that spoke more than words ever could. They were together in this, bound by necessity, by trust, by something deeper that neither had fully understood until this moment. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the mist thickening, the tension building to a peak she could almost feel in her bones. And as the first rays of dawn began to filter through the mist, she realized with a jolt that the next moments would decide everything. The searchers were closing in, the ridge offered no more cover, and the forest itself had become a maze of uncertainty. Every choice, every move, every heartbeat was critical. She could see the determination in the Apache's eyes, the readiness in his stance, and she knew that their fate, freedom, survival, and the life that awaited rested on the edge of this moment. The sound of hooves and shouts grew louder, closer, every second stretching into an eternity. She felt her heart hammering, her mind racing, her entire body poised between fear and exhilaration. The Apache whispered once, a single word she could not understand, yet the meaning was clear. "Trust me." She nodded, taking a deep breath, and together they stepped into the open, ready to face whatever came next. The forest seemed to tense around them, the mist curling like smoke, shadows shifting, the world holding its breath. Every sense was heightened, every nerve alive with the anticipation of the coming confrontation. She realized that this was the climax of the chase, the moment when every secret, every choice, every act of courage would collide. And yet, Even as danger pressed in from all sides, she felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of what could come if they survived, if they overcame the trials that lay ahead. The Apache moved like a shadow, fluid and precise, guiding her toward the ridge's edge where the forest opened into the hills beyond. The searchers were almost upon them, the first of them breaking into the clearing below. She felt a surge of fear and determination, knowing that this was the point where everything could change, where the outcome was uncertain and where the bond they had built in secrecy would be tested like never before. And in that moment, as the first light of day touched the treetops, she realized that the story of her life and of the Apaches was about to reach its most intense, suspenseful turning point. Every choice they had made, every act of courage, every whisper of trust had led here, and nothing beyond this moment could be predicted. The air was thick with anticipation, the forest alive with unseen dangers, and the future stretched out before them, wild, uncertain, and impossible to ignore. The next steps they took, the next decisions, would shape everything. And as the voices of the searchers drew nearer, she understood with absolute clarity that the true test of courage, trust, and destiny was only just beginning. The first light of morning broke fully across the hills, and with it, the tension that had pressed so heavily on their shoulders began to loosen, just enough to allow a glimmer of hope. The Apache moved ahead with a careful, deliberate pace, leading the rancher's wife along the ridge toward a small, hidden stream. She followed, breathing heavily, every muscle aching, yet her heart was lighter with every step that carried them farther from the danger below. The sounds of the searchers were fading now, their shouts and hooves growing distant, swallowed by the hills and the forest. She dared to hope that the storm of pursuit had passed, if only for a moment. They reached the stream, and she sank to her knees, letting the cool water run over her hands, washing away the mud and grime that clung to her. The Apache crouched nearby, his dark eyes scanning the surrounding hills, always alert, yet there was a faint relaxation in his posture. She looked at him, and for the first time allowed herself to see not only the survivor, the warrior, the man who had guided her through danger, but also the companion, the presence who had become central to her life. She realized that her fear and adrenaline had been tempered by trust, and that trust had grown into something deeper, something lasting. He finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "We are not safe yet," he said, and she nodded. There was no relief in his tone, only a recognition that freedom was not given, it was taken, earned through patience, wit, and courage. She felt a wave of admiration for him, for his skill, his vigilance, his unwavering focus. And yet, she also felt a sense of calm settle over her, a sense that whatever came next, they would face it together, and that whatever trials remained would not diminish the bond that had grown between them. The path ahead led them along the stream, winding through the forest until the trees thinned and the open plains stretched out before them. She could see the ranch in the distance, the familiar outlines of the homestead and barns, yet it felt like a different world now. The life she had known, the quiet routines, the predictable days, seemed distant, almost irrelevant. She realized that the storm, the chase, and the fear had changed her, had sharpened her instincts and strengthened her courage. And the Apache beside her had been the catalyst for that change, the one who had transformed her life with his presence, his protection, and his unwavering resolve. As they moved closer to the ranch, she felt the first stirrings of a plan forming. They could not return openly. Too much had changed, and the searchers might still be watching. But there were ways to reclaim safety without surrendering the freedom they had fought to earn. She glanced at the Apache, who met her gaze with a faint smile, the first trace of softness she had seen in his eyes since the chase had begun. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight of promise, a signal that they had endured the worst together and that something lasting could grow from it. The rancher's wife thought of the past days, the secret feeding, the quiet gestures of care, the moments when fear had been balanced with trust. Every choice she had made, every risk she had taken, had led them here. And she realized that the lessons of those days, patience, courage, observation, trust, would guide them now as they approached the final challenges. The land itself seemed to welcome them, the first rays of sunlight painting the plains gold, the morning air crisp and clear. It was as if the world acknowledged the trials they had endured and offered a chance for renewal. As they reached the edge of the ranch, a figure appeared in the distance, a rider on horseback, calling out across the plains. She tensed, fear flashing in her chest, but the Apache placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He nodded toward her, a silent command to stay calm. The rider approached cautiously, and she recognized the familiar figure of one of the ranch hands who had remained loyal to her husband, but not fully aware of the chase that had taken place. He carried no weapons, only a look of concern and confusion. The rider slowed as they came closer, eyes flicking from the Apache to the rancher's wife. "Is everything all right?" he called, his voice carrying across the plains. She nodded, stepping forward cautiously, and the Apache followed at her side. The tension that had gripped her for so long began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. The immediate danger had passed, the searchers were gone, and the first threads of a new life were beginning to take shape. The rancher's wife looked at the Apache, and in that moment she saw the full measure of the bond they had built. He had been a stranger, a captive, a source of fear and uncertainty, and now he was the one she trusted completely, the one who had guided her through danger, the one who had become central to her life. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet joy that was not loud or flashy, but steady and enduring. She realized that life on the frontier had always been uncertain, but with him beside her, she felt capable of facing anything that came next. They returned to the homestead slowly, the sun rising fully over the plains, the land bathed in light. She could see the familiar buildings, the animals in the pens, the fences stretching across the property, and yet everything felt different. The ranch was still the ranch, but she understood now that her life had changed irrevocably. The Apache had not only saved her life, but had reshaped her understanding of courage, loyalty, and trust. Every lesson, every risk, every moment of fear had been worth it because it had led her to a life she could not have imagined before. Her husband appeared at the door of the main house, looking startled to see them approaching. There was a tense moment, a pause heavy with unspoken questions, and she felt a surge of determination. This confrontation would not be one of violence or anger, but of truth. She stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on the Apache's arm, and spoke with quiet resolve. "We are safe now," she said, and though her husband did not fully understand, he could see the strength in her eyes, the calm confidence she carried. The fear that had gripped her days ago was gone, replaced by a sense of certainty and purpose. The Apache spoke next, his voice steady and respectful. He explained carefully that he had no intention of causing harm to the ranch, that the pursuit was over, and that he sought only to live freely alongside the woman who had trusted him. Her husband listened, skeptical at first, but slowly the tension in his stance eased. He could see that the bond between them was strong, that the trust they had built in danger was real and unbreakable, and that trying to separate them would serve no purpose. The rancher's wife felt a quiet relief wash over her, the final obstacle between fear and freedom lifting from her shoulders. Over the next hours, the ranch began to return to its usual rhythms, yet the presence of the Apache changed everything. He worked alongside her on the land, helping with the chores, guiding animals, repairing fences, and sharing knowledge of the land that she had never known. His skills, once feared by her and others, became a source of strength and resilience. She found herself laughing quietly at his small jokes, admiring the precision with which he moved, and marveling at the way he seemed to belong to the land in a way that she had only glimpsed before. Night fell, and with it a quiet calm settled over the ranch. The Apache sat beside her on the porch, the stars stretching endlessly overhead, the wind carrying the scents of grass, earth, and distant hills. She leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet assurance that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. She reflected on the days of fear and uncertainty, of risk and survival, and realized that each moment had shaped them, had forged a bond that could withstand any trial. She thought of the future, of the life they could build together, and felt a quiet excitement. The challenges of the frontier remained, the unpredictability of the land and its people still a factor. But with him beside her, she felt capable, ready, and alive in a way she had never been before. The fear that had driven her actions in the past was replaced by trust, courage, and the understanding that life, even in its harshest form, could be beautiful, fulfilling, and full of possibility. In the quiet moments that followed, she allowed herself to feel gratitude for the Apache who had entered her life, for the bond that had grown in secrecy and danger, for the lessons of patience, courage, and trust that had been tested and proven. She realized that the story of the chase, the pursuit, and the survival would remain with her forever, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of connection in even the most unlikely circumstances. The Apache turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight, and she saw in them not only the survivor of the storm, but the man who had become her companion, her anchor, and the one who had transformed her world. She reached for his hand, feeling the familiar warmth and strength, and together they sat in silence, the land around them quiet, the stars overhead infinite. The past dangers had passed, the threats had faded, and the future stretched out before them, full of possibility, hope, and promise. As the night deepened, she realized that life on the frontier had never been simple, never predictable, yet it had given her something far greater than routine or safety. It had given her courage, trust, and a bond forged in the crucible of fear and survival. The Apache beside her was not just a part of her past, nor simply a protector. He was the one who had become central to her life, the one who had reshaped her understanding of love, partnership, and destiny. The first light of dawn promised a new beginning. The ranch lay quiet, the land stretching into the distance, and the world seemed full of possibility. She knew that challenges would come, that the unpredictability of frontier life would continue, yet the foundation had been laid. The lessons of patience, trust, and courage would guide them, and the bond they had forged would withstand whatever trials awaited. She glanced at the Apache once more, feeling the depth of her gratitude and the strength of her feelings. Together, they had survived fear, danger, and uncertainty, and together they would face whatever lay ahead. The storm had passed, the chase was over, and a life of freedom, trust, and shared purpose awaited them. She knew that this was not only the end of one story, but the beginning of another, a life full of hope, resilience, and the quiet certainty that the choices they had made had led them exactly where they were meant to be. And so, as the first rays of sunlight touched the hills, painting the land in gold, she allowed herself to relax fully for the first time. The rancher's wife and the Apache had survived the storm, outwitted the pursuers, and emerged stronger, bound by trust and courage. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise, and they would face it together, step by step, hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever life had to offer. The past had tested them, the danger had shaped them, and now, at last, the dawn of a new beginning was theirs.